Hello, and welcome to the third webinar in our series based on the new Oxford University Press book, Putting Purpose into Practice. Last week, we discussed enacting purpose in organizations. You can watch the session recording on our website, puttingpurposeintopractice.org. The topic of today's webinar is measuring purpose. It will last for 1 hour, including a Q&A section at the end. Please submit your questions through the Zoom Q&A function at any point during the session. We will be focusing on chapters 10 through 15, which you can read online for free at purposeintopractice.org. Following the webinar, feel free to join the conversation on social media using the hashtag #PurposeIntoPractice. We are taking a break next week and will return on Wednesday, the 7th of April to discuss the roots of the Economics of Mutuality at Mars Incorporated. We will be joined by Mars CEO Grant Reed and former chairman of the board at Mars, Stephen Badger. I will now hand over to the book's co-editor, who will introduce you to today's speakers. Bruno Roche is EOM founder and executive director and former chief economist at Mars. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, and welcome to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, wherever you are joining us. So yes, my name is Bruno, and I am the co-editor of the book with my colleague and dear friend Colin Mayer, who is Peter Moore's Professor of Management Studies at the Saïd School at University of Oxford, and also the author of several very interesting books. The book that we are presenting today represents the culmination of 15 years of in-depth research with Oxford and other academic institutions and business practices with Mars and other multinational corporations. It started within Mars in 2007, so almost 15 years ago, and actually 18 months before the crisis with a question from the board. And the board questions at the time was, what should be the right level of profits? And the question was not asked in the context of should we make more money or less money, but what is the right level of profit that would eventually maximize and optimize the performance of the company in the ecosystem in which it operates. It gathered further momentum since 2014 when Colin and his team at Oxford have joined us and created the Oxford Economics of Mutuality Lab. So we are very happy to welcome you to the third series of this webinar to launch the book, which will be focusing on measuring purpose. So today we want to continue to speak about purpose in business, or rather achieving purpose in business, which is the highest aspiration of any organization and individuals. It is our argument that most successful businesses are driven by a sense of purpose that transcends self-interest, a sense of purpose that transforms performance by creating a mutuality of benefits among all stakeholders. It's also our argument that the real issue is not the holding of purpose, but it is a definition of purpose, which was the topic of the first webinar, the enactment of purpose, which was the topic of the second webinar last week, and the measurement of purpose through new metrics and new accounting approaches. In a word, it's about putting purpose into practice. And that's the topic of this seminar of today. So having a purpose and not putting it into practice is essentially like a man who looks in a mirror and sees himself as he is. He takes a good look at himself and then he goes away and at once forgets what he looks like. It is certainly our argument that the achievement of purpose has become even more necessary as global challenges accelerate, as we have also facing difficulties at the COVID and as global unpredictability accelerates. It is also our purpose that the real battle for the world today is not between Islam and the West. It's not between China and the United States, or liberalism and protectionism, but it is between purpose and confusion. It is between achieving purpose and perpetuating confusion. It is a battle that leaders face daily. It's not an abstract thing, but it is a real, living, breathing conflict. And this is the essence, in our view, of modern economics, a battle for purpose in a world of confusion. Not just having a purpose, but making that purpose real at every level of the organization, especially when the odds are so resolutely stacked against you. This is the objective of the Economics of Mutuality, completing capitalism and transforming the economic system by creating a mutuality of benefit among all stakeholders. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you all today to this third series of webinars to launch a book. We have assembled a great panel of thought leaders coming from business, but also from academia. And what actually is distinctive about the panel today is that they all have not only a passion, but also a track record to put purpose into practice. We want this session to be interactive, and we want to offer enough space and enough time for questions and dialogue. As the philosopher Karl Jesper said, truth starts with two people. So we hope actually that through our dialogue that's starting today, we're going to create the condition which is conducive for meaningful conversations to happen and for truth to start between our conversations. I now wish to hand over to Judith Stroehle, who is a senior research fellow at the Saïd Business School in Oxford. She's been a long-term friend and partner. She was leading, together with Canin and I, the Economics of Mutuality lab, and she's now leading a very interesting initiative called the Rethinking Performance Initiative. Her research focuses on how tools of finance, accounting, and reporting can help to implement purpose in business. But Judith, before I hand over to you to moderate our panel and introduce our speakers, I'd like you to say a few words about a paper that you co-published recently called Measuring Purpose. And I know this paper actually has attracted quite a lot of attention. I think it's still in the top 10 download on the SSRN network. And especially I'd like you to say a few words about how through this paper, you design the future of performance measurement and the future of accounting in business.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Thank you very much, Bruno, for this kind introduction. And thank you very much for having us here. Congratulations for this brilliant book that I'm sure we'll draw on for many years and many projects to come. So I'm happy to speak quickly about the paper that we've written, that we've just released in January this year, of which you are a co-author. And many of the people that contributed to the book have actually contributed to this paper as well. It will be a good framing for what we want to talk about with Bob and Loic, our two speakers of today. So let me just take a few minutes to outline what we actually talk about. The paper is called Measuring Purpose, an Integrated Framework, and you can download it both from the EOM website as well as SSRN, as Bruno just mentioned, and it is on the Oxford website as well. So should be easy to find for anyone who wants to read it. The objective of this paper was really to bring clarity into the measurement space. Now, anyone who has ever tried to do non-financial sustainability measurement will know that this space is very complicated. Some call it an alphabet soup, others don't like this word, but it is for sure very, very complicated and complex. Now, what we try to do in this paper is to order a little bit what is going on. And we do this by outlining three functions of measurement: reporting, accounting, and accounting for costs specifically, and valuation. Now, why do we do this? We do this because measurement is not a gray space. Measurement is a granular space, and measurement has different purposes. And by knowing what the different purposes and functions of measurement are, it is much easier to understand what to use and which frameworks to use for which purpose. Now, reporting, in the way that we outline it in the paper, is essentially the non-financial performance in its own entity. So think of carbon footprint, which is reported in gigatons of CO2 equivalents. This is the whole space of non-financial reporting, Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, GRI, ESG, all of the acronyms that we know about. But beyond the metrics in our own entity, we also have the opportunity to actually put monetary values to what we call non-financial metrics or environmental and social issues. Now, here we have two spaces. We have the accounting for cost space and we have the valuation space. It's really important to know the difference between the two. Accounting for cost essentially looks at the cost to firms. So essentially what is associated with delivering on purpose for an organization? What is the capital allocation? What are the investments needed? The valuation side, on the other hand, looks at the cost to society associated with the firm's impact. And so really the question of what is the magnitude and why should this matter and why does it matter to stakeholders of the firm? Now, what the useful thing is about thinking about these different functions is because Here we outline that measurement has a purpose, and so therefore not every firm should measure everything, right? Measurement needs to be tied to purpose. And so we outline how a firm can go from motives, so really the notion of its purpose, to the appropriate metrics that measure this purpose, and in some instances, why and how it might be useful to use monetization. It allows us to observe a variety of things, and it leads into interesting discussions around how different methodologies fit into the bigger picture, where and how different organizations work in this space, and sort of where the knowledge and how far the knowledge is in different areas. We'll learn from our speakers today about how certain methodologies are already being applied. We know that in ESG space, for example, there's a lot. The non-financial reporting space is very, very ripe for a lot of exciting developments, but the evaluation space and the accounting space still needs a lot of work. And there's brilliant projects like the Economics of Mutuality, but also, for example, our colleagues at Harvard Business School who are working on methodologies in the space of valuation and cost accounting. Now, the bottom line of this is implementing purpose is obviously not a singular action. As we see, we have various workshops around this. And it is an integration of multiple activities, and measurement is one of those activities. And it is a very important and very granular activity. And no one better could speak to this than our two speakers today. And so I do want to move to introducing them. Our first speaker today will be Robert Eccles, who is a visiting professor of management practice at Oxford. He is a former Harvard Business School professor and a leading authority on ESG integration, one of the world's foremost academic experts in integrated reporting. Bob describes himself as a capital market activist, and he has done a few things that made good on that promise. So he is the founding chairman of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board and one of the founders of the International Integrated Reporting Council. I'm sure he'll let us know about lots of the other fun things he's been up to recently. Welcome, Bob. Our second speaker will be Loic Moutault. He is the president of Royal Canin, a division of Mars Incorporated. Loic manages the global organization's corporate direction and strategy, which means he is managing a multi-billion-dollar business in over 90 countries. Loic has had an impressive international career in Asia, Europe, and globally within Mars. And he's a leader who is very passionate about about how businesses can create value for society. He's been a fierce supporter because of that of Economics of Mutuality, and we'll be very interested to hear how he's implementing this into his business today. So let's start with Bob. I will ask both of you questions. You will have about 10 minutes to make your initial statements around them, and then we will open the floor for Q&A. As Nick already said at the beginning of the sessions, please do put your questions in the Q&A box. I will monitor them, and we'll get to hopefully all of them by the end of it. We will finish timely on the hour. So if you do want to get your word in, better put your questions in earlier than later. Right, Bob, let's get to you. As I just said, you're one of the leading academic experts on non-financial measurement. Now, let me please ask you to reflect on what is happening in this space right now, particularly with a view to standardization and increased regulation. I'd also be interested to hear from you how this ties into developments on the global capital markets and what investors are increasingly focused on. Over to you.
So thank you, Judith. You've given me the most boring thing to talk about, standards for non-financial information. I like boring things. I met my wife on a blind date when I was writing a book about transfer pricing, and I spent the whole date over dinner talking about my book on transfer pricing. So I think not only am I a capital market activist, but I have a certain predilection for the arcane. And certainly this world of standards for non-financial information would go into that category. If you look at it over the sweep of history, it's actually very interesting. I started writing about this sort of 30 years ago, even before it was lunatic fringe activity. Early 90s, 1997, GRI was formed, really a monumental thing in a lot of ways, saying that there's externalities that companies create that aren't captured in the financial statements, and that stakeholders care about it. Maybe investors don't yet. Over 8,000 companies around the world, largely on a voluntary basis. In 2010, the International Integrated Reporting Council was formed. That was a framework. A year later, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And I think it's important to compare GRI and SASB because they do different things. SASB was framed in the perspective of what investors care about, materiality defined in that context. GRI defines materiality as an externality. SASB took a sector focus, what's material matters, whether you're a bank or a pharmaceutical company. GRI was looking at it more in terms of kind of general things that are externalities that are being created by companies. And obviously carbon will be more from an oil and gas company than a bank. And so I see them as pretty complementary, although there's been a lot of kind of headbutting between the organizations over the years. Then Climate Disclosure Standards Board was formed, TCFD as a framework. And so the good news is that you had a number of organizations that were working in the space. Bruno talked about confusion versus purpose. I mean, if you want to find confusion in the small, go look at what's going on with NGOs attempting to set standards for sustainability information. And what's interesting is that over this period of time where it went from nobody cared to companies are kind of doing it, still a lot of greenwashing, investors really not caring at all. That flipped, investors started caring about it when they realized that ESG issues matter to financial performance. And there became this desire in the capital markets to get to standards. But until very recently, if you look at what the narrative was, it was we're going to get it through market forces. If investors really care about this, then companies are going to report it, and we're not going to pick the winner between GRI and SASB. Market forces will sort it out. And I always thought that that was absolutely ludicrous, to tell you the truth, because we didn't get to accounting standards through market forces. We got US GAAP because the SEC was formed. It was basically regulation that got us to international financial reporting standards. And then something really important happened in September of last year. The IFRS Foundation, which oversees the International Accounting Standards Board, which sets international financial reporting standards, which most of the world uses. Of course, we've got to have US exceptionalism. We've got our own thing, and they tried to merge them. It didn't work, but wherever. So they came out with a proposal, a consultation document saying, we're thinking about establishing a sustainability standards board. Imagine that. I mean, 2 years ago, Richard Barker and I had conversations. We were doing this green paper on should FASB and ISP set standards, and it wasn't on the agenda. So they came out with something incredibly bold and said, look, we know how to set standards, and we've got institutional legitimacy. Let's create an organization called the Sustainability Standards Board that will sit in parallel to the International Accounting Standards Board. We mediate the space between companies and investors in terms of what should be reported. And so what does the world think of this? There was a 90-day consultation period. 577 responses were sent in. Oxford sent in a response letter. Richard and I sent in a longer one. The responses were overwhelmingly positive. There was a big debate about single level materiality. Maybe we can deal with that in the Q&A, but largely the response was quite positive. The investor community weighed in very heavily. All the big investors, BlackRock was already calling for companies to report according to SASB and TCFD. Corporate community weighed in, not quite as much, but kind of support for that is building. And they now, as of earlier this month, the trustees had a meeting and they've said, we're going to do this. They're going to start with climate. Judith talked about climate. It's a little easier with environmental issues than social issues. They want to launch it in some formal way at COP26. They're in the process of now figuring out how to fund the organization, how to staff the organization. IOSCO, the International Association of Securities Commissions, 3 or 4 weeks ago, came out with a very fulsome statement in support of the Sustainability Standards Board. And what's interesting about that is if you kind of know how IOSCO works, is that typically they're the last caboose to leave the train station. Once kind of there's been a consensus that something should happen, they put the good housekeeping seal of approval on it and say, yeah, we think this is swell. They were much more kind of foot forward on this, and they've come out quite positive. And then earlier this week, late last week, I can't remember, they announced that they're going to form a working group. The project director for this working group is an Oxford grad named Clara Barbie, brilliant woman who was the CEO of the Impact Management Project, who did a lot of work to bring together these different NGOs, SASB, GRI, and so forth, which will be input to the Sustainability Standards Board, along with work from the IBCWEF, other organizations. So you have now a working group that's been formed, which will be the so-called Value Reporting Foundation. SASB and IRC have agreed to merge. CDSB will be part of that, TCFD representation and IBCWEF. And to just kind of sum it up, I mean, my vision for this, and we'll see what happens, but I think the goal, Judith, and just to take a lot of these acronyms off the table, it may take time. The IP, the work, the standards, the frameworks, there's a lot of technical issues to be addressed, but you take the work of SASB, TCFD, CDSB, IBCWF, that rolls into the SSB. Those acronyms can go away. A little more complicated what happens with GRI, because again, as I said in the beginning, they have more of a stakeholder focus on externalities, where what the SSB, the Sustainability Standards Board, is going to be doing, their expertise is in setting standards between companies and investors. But maybe the last comment is that the line is a blurry one. There's this notion of dynamic materiality that people may have heard of. So there's things that are important to the world today, say through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals, that investors may not care about now. Climate change would be an example of that 50 years ago. But as the world changes, as NGOs do their work, as we recognize resource limitations, as social expectations change, these things become material to investors. I think what COVID-19 has done, Bruno mentioned that, is it's made some social issues in the United States, issues like Black Lives Matter, income inequality is certainly becoming more important system level risk all over the world. And so the thinking now is that there be an advisory council of some kind for the Sustainability Standards Board that'll track really what these issues are that the world cares about. The EU taxonomy, I think, is a particularly good approach to sort of doing that. And so I'm hoping that within 2 or 3 years, we have a relatively solid set of standards that will be required reporting. Remarkably enough, in the United States, the SEC, the acting director of the Division of Corporation Finance, John Coates, is a friend of mine. He's been very positive. Acting chair, Allison Heron-Lee. So imagine a world where we have a global set of standards for sustainability reporting, just like we have for financial reporting. It's a huge deal. Same quality internal control and measurement systems, same quality of assurance. Then jurisdictions will be able to supplement and top it up, like the EU is doing with this taxonomy, to say, well, that's great, but there's other things that maybe they haven't cleared the bar of materiality for the SSB yet, like biodiversity is something you hear a lot about today. And so we're going to be setting standards on that. So let me end there, Judith, and then thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Bob. And there's already been a lot of questions for you, but we'll keep them to the end before we get to them. So thank you. Let the questions keep coming. Loic, let's move to you. Loic, you are a leading practitioner in putting purpose into practice. And we'd love to hear from you a little bit. How, in concrete terms in your firm, does purpose drive strategy? What are the metrics that you use for purpose, and how do these metrics actually factor into the financial equation? Floor is yours.
Thank you, Judith. Yeah, and it's fair to say that it is a live matter. So I would not say I have the recipe and we've done it, but we're certainly trying to practice it. So I lead, and I will try to be very concrete, which means that I might have to get a bit specific about the nature of my organization and what we're doing. So first, the reason why I really came to this was because I actually, meeting Bruno in Singapore at the time when I was running Asia Pacific, I realized in a number of the markets where we had really a big disruption in the environment, that our business was really thriving when others were really suffering. And I knew we were good, but there was something happening that was not entirely planned from our point of view. And I actually realized that there was a correlation between our capacity to invest in the communities we serve in the different markets and how thriving our business was. And basically a direct correlation between the investment we were making in veterinary community, breeder community, which we serve. And when we lacked that investment for years, our brands was much more exposed to the changing nature of the environment and the context. So I lead Wild Canin. Wild Canin is making nutrition for cats and dogs. We actually do what we call health nutrition products. So we are really targeted. We run more than 500 formulas from therapeutic nutrition. So nutrition that as part of a path to care and can prevent or help addressing physiological issues in cats and dogs, to nutrition for breeding activity, to nutrition for healthy cats and dogs, but with specific conditions such as breed-specific nutrition or different life stage and specific conditions. So it's really, and for us, in our DNA, we've always seen nutrition as a way to improve the health of the animals. And I will just explain why in 1 second. Is for human being, we are responsible of our diet. We basically choose the food we take. When you talk about cats and dogs, very often 80 to 90% of the nutrition comes from one product that the owner is choosing on the behalf of the cat or the dogs, which means that the safety requirements we have are much more important. So if there is a mycotoxin contamination in your cereals in the morning at the breakfast, your body can deal with it. If the same thing happened for cats and dog food, actually, it could be really dangerous. So I know it's kind of a dilemma or paradox, but in fact, the stringence of food safety and quality are really high in our industry. But the flip side of that is we can impact the physiology for nutrition much more than any food manufacturer can do, basically for a human being. Saying that, our entire business is about that. So we decided to define our purpose as a company, really to make a better world for pets. So we have a point of view that pets make the world better for humans, and we want to make a better world for pets. And we want to do that by improving the health of cats and dogs through animals. And so the methodology we follow is, you define this purpose for your business, and you look at the meaningful challenges in basically in your industry or in your ecosystem. So once you define that purpose, in our case, make a better world for pets, improve the health of cats and dogs. Then what we did is we mapped the ecosystem of stakeholders around the pet owners. So everybody who interacts, the final consumer, if you want, which is a pet owner and the pet, breeders, veterinarians, pet shops, kennel clubs, all sorts of regulators potentially, pharmaceutical companies and so on and so on. And we looked at the quality of the relationship between the different stakeholders of that ecosystem. And we mapped it using Economics of Mutuality with the 3 forms of capital we looked at, which was social, human, and financial. We didn't look at natural in this particular case. And looking at that, we basically looked at where are the pain points. So rather than just selling kibbles in a bag, we really look at the stakeholders around us and the stakeholders around the pet owner that can have an impact on the health of that pet, either because of the advice they provide or basically the service they provide in general, or the products that they make. And by identifying the weak points and the pain points, then what we do is we design an intervention that is there to help the entire health of that ecosystem. And that doesn't have, of course, it's correlated to our capability and competency, but it goes way larger than the kind of output measures that we would normally look at. And this is really the first message I want to give. To measure purpose, you need to actually measure the external performance, not the internal performance of the company. So you need to measure the impact you have and the outcome you create for somebody else. And that's really a shift of paradigm. So you move from the output of your business and what are the input measures you need to put into your system to trigger an output. You really start from the impact and the outcome. And then you design what we call outcome-based strategy. So once we have mapped this ecosystem, identified the pain points we want to solve, we design activities for an outcome. And we test those activities. Are those activities shifting the outcome in the direction we want? And if we can prove that, then of course, we move into deployment. And when we move into deployment, then we enter the classic output metrics that a business and an entity will actually monitor. So you focus your output measure on the quality of your execution and deployment. But the entire first phase becomes look at the impact, look at the transformation you want to make in that ecosystem, identify the outcome you want to create, and test the initiatives and their impact on this outcome before you validate them and roll them out. Now, one could say that this is making life way too complicated, but in fact, it's expanding your thinking. So don't take me wrong, we are not a philanthropic organization. We are a very highly performing entity of Mars Inc. And where we look at it, we simply do that because it actually delivers superior value for the entire chain. So it's not only value for us, obviously, it's value for all the stakeholders. But we notice that when we are doing that, we simply have a better thriving business. So I give you examples of outcome, the kind of impact measure we have for our purpose. So we are now looking at the quality of life of cats and dogs that we serve. We're looking at health-adjusted life expectancy. So are they living longer or not? Thanks to our intervention overall, thanks to the health of the ecosystem. If I take the specificity of a veterinarian that we serve, it's a distressed population. Many veterinarians are really struggling. They have high debt level because of education. There is a very high suicide rate. So actually, we measure a kind of well-being of the veterinarians and an NPS of will you actually recommend to your children to become a veterinarian? And by measuring that and by doing activities that will contribute to improve veterinarian well-being, we believe we are expanding the health of our ecosystem. Why? Because if we have, it's impossible to be a good pet owner without professionals around you. Pets can't speak, they hide their pain. You need professionals to understand how they are. And therefore they are key elements of our ecosystem. And obviously for us, the more pets and pet owners, the better is our business. The more pet professionals like their job, the better they provide a service, the easier they make pet ownership happening. So you can see the chain of looking from the impact you want to have to the outcome for the community you serve and how you design your activities for that. And so in our case, helping veterinarians, easing their work, improving their level of knowledge and experience is part of our job. Although on paper, we only make kibbles in a bag that we sell. And this is really what we are trying to implement. So we design those interventions and those activities, implement them, and when we find that they are working, we implement them around the world. And we measure the overall value they create holistically. Typically, for example, we will be running very regularly what we call a vet business forum. Why are we doing that? Veterinarians are educated on the pathology, the disease, the physiology of the animal. They don't know how to run a practice. They've never been taught how to manage people. Now, if we help them do that, and it's easier for them to do that, they will be happier and their well-being will be stronger, their practice will run better, and we will be able to equip them with the right knowledge and education so that actually they can provide a better health outcome for the cats and the dogs. So you see the connection with our meta purpose, which is improving the health of cats and dogs. And this is how we trigger the chain, if you want, of the practice we make. And in order to do that, we have to align the incentive in our teams to be able to move this way. And one of the issues I have with the financial management system is it gives me the costs and the revenue. It doesn't tell me whether my team on the ground is actually executing really on the lever that will make this ecosystem thrive. So typically, if one of my general managers decide to cut corners and stop investing in education for veterinarians or support to breeders, I will not see it through the management account books today. And I will find out only years later when the business starts tumbling that we have shortcut the investment in the communities we serve. And this is really the challenge I gave to Bruno and at the time the Oxford community a few years ago is we need help. We really need to understand better the value we create or we don't create and stop seeing everything we do as cost, but some of them are investment in value creation. That value creation might be external, but improve the holistic value that we create in our ecosystem. And this is what we are doing. So today we are working on an integrated scorecard by the community we serve that start from the outcome and then goes towards the output, obviously, which is something we can measure more regularly. Now, the difficulty, of course, is outcome measures tend to be longer term metrics. It's not something that is changing every week. It's changing maybe twice a year or every year. You need to measure that over time. And that's why you need to have proxies into your output metrics that you have tested before. And if you know you have tested the link between your output metrics and your outcome, are you really shifting this outcome? then you can manage through your classic output measurement inside the business. So today we are working in an integrated scorecard. We are not yet at the level where we can integrate that in accounting. And the only area where we are able to do it, funnily enough, is on sustainability. And I will just finish on this point with the case of carbon, for example. We have managed to map the entire footprint of our operation, of our CO2 emission, by raw materials that we are using, which means that we integrated this in our operating system. So when our formulators are creating the recipes, they see not only, of course, the nutritional profile and the cost, they see as well the CO2 footprint of that recipe. So they can start optimizing that. And we cost it inside our management books, not as a tax, but as an internal fee that enables us to enable the normal financial system to actually optimize for this as if it was a cost. And the beauty of that is it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a virtual cycle, because obviously this is not yet a tax at the moment necessarily. Therefore, when we charge it internally, we create an accrual or provision that in turn becomes an investment capacity for CO2 reduction initiatives in our business. So we are moving our teams from having to fight for resources to reduce CO2 to it's becoming an incentive to reduce the internal cost inside the business, actually reduce the CO2 footprint. And it's accelerating the momentum. And what we think we should have, we could have done in 10 or 15 years, we find now we can really accelerate some of that in less than 5 or 10 now. But the point is, when you start being able to integrate the externalities in your management accounting, I'm not even talking about standard at this stage, but management accounting, and you reflect those externalities in, you become truer to the value creation you create, and you actually can use the power of the financial system to optimize that performance for good. So I will simply finish on this, which is really something we've implemented this year. We integrate the kind of carbon fee inside our management account to be able to recognize that externality and optimize it and use the power of the financial reporting system and our normal operating system to be able to reduce the footprint, reduce the cost, but at the same time free up funds to invest into CO2 reduction activities.
Thank you very much, Loic. This was extremely interesting, and you know that we're all very excited about the work that is going on at Royal Canin. So, my compliments. Now, let me start with a quite specific question that has come in for Loic, and then I'll move on with a quite specific question that's come in for Bob, and then we'll take some that are perhaps good for answers from both of you. Look, there's one question, actually two questions that go a little bit more specific into the question around which measures you use. And Bruska here asks whether you also consider using hybrid metrics such as EBITDA over increase in life expectancy. And that's one question. The other question that came in is, what historical business metrics have you stopped targeting and reporting now that you have new impact and outcome metrics?
So on the first question, we haven't moved to that yet. We are not yet able to correlate that directly, if you want. So we have not done what you would call hybrid metrics. We really make this sequence between impact metrics, outcome metrics, and then we establish the connection with input metrics, but we don't correlate it, yet to the bottom line. And in truth, because we have a hypothesis, obviously, and an assumption, and we establish the correlation that if we make pet ownership aspirational, there will be more pet owners. And if the service around them are high quality, we make that easier. And by making that easier, we're growing the pie. We're finding, we're actually improve the quality of service of all the stakeholders in the ecosystem. And by doing that, we're creating somehow the overall value increases. So that assumption has been kind of tested and proven. So we don't need to make that correlation directly today. So we have not made that consideration. what kind of other metrics we have dropped? Well, I must say that, for example, I know it sounds weird and it might be shocking to some, but we look less and less at market shares by doing that, because you kind of strengthen your belief in your business system, in your business formula, in your value creation formula. So it becomes a kind of, of course you're competing with competitors, but when you really look at outcome metrics, you start worrying about the people you serve much more. And by doing that, the implicit view is that, they will work deeper with you. So you will deepen the partnership with them. And it becomes less of a concern whether somebody else is outbidding you somewhere, because that partnership becomes, very close, and they have no interest to move to somebody else. Now, you could say, well, okay, so it's good old competitive measurement, but in fact, I think it's improving the quality that all of us have to make. So the more we're helping vets and breeders, and if our competitors are doing the same, somehow, we are raising the game for everybody. And so that's one measure that, honestly, in my business, we look less at market share than in previous business that I've been running before. Now, I still get all of the financial metrics analysis every month. We haven't got rid of them. But in fact, what is, I would say what is more rewarding is when you start defining your strategies based on the outcome you want to create, some of those financial measures become, it's not that they disappear, they become less relevant. Because you're more genuine on your strategies are more powerful. The risk with an output-based strategy is if you get it wrong, i.e. it doesn't stick with your audience, then you've put a lot of resources behind something that doesn't have an impact. So in fact, when you focus on outcome, you expand your thinking and you get closer to the customer you serve. So you simply improve your relevance. And by doing that, the rest of the financial metrics become less necessary to optimize to death, if you see what I mean. But I would say it's a journey, and honestly, we're not there yet. We are all learning about how to practice this. So there is still a lot of cleaning to do, and we have not landed it yet to what Bruno will call a single bottom line. So we're really still looking at how we can do that, how we can measure social capital and human capital in the same way as, for example, we can bring natural capital in, like I've just explained with carbon.
Thank you very much, Loic. That was extremely helpful. Really, really interesting. Bob, I'd like to convey one question to you, and it's sort of well, it shows how complicated this space is, even though you've been trying to explain it really well to us. So there's a couple of questions that have come in to essentially ask how everything that you talked about in the standardization space relates to other things that are going on. And specifically, there have been questions around the work of the WEF and the IBC on the one hand, and there have been questions around the EU Sustainable Finance Disclosure Directive. Could you make a few comments around how all of these things fit together?
Sure, and I also saw something in there about SFDR, so I'll try and touch on that. In terms of the IBC WEF initiative, so in September, when the Sustainability Standards Board proposal came out from the trustees, there was two other papers. There was one from the five, sponsored by the Impact Management Project, which is SASB and IRC and so forth. And it was basically, we're going to work together to create a comprehensive reporting system. And IBC WEF came out with their report on sort of 21 common metrics for stakeholder capitalism. And I think, the messaging, probably wasn't as precise as it needed to be. It created some confusion. People thought, is this supposed to be another set of standards like SASB or like this SSB? So I've been digging into this, to be honest. I interviewed Brian Moynihan, who was the chairman and CEO of Bank of America, was the chair of IBC WEF, wrote that up, in December on Forbes. And then I've been talking with them about how they see this all fitting together. And so let me just say for now, watch this space. Watch this space, hopefully this week. I think you're going to see something that will sort of put this in perspective in terms, and as I mentioned, there's a working group that the IBCWF is a member of. So when you think about IBCWF, they didn't try to come up with another set of standards. They basically came up with, they think, issues that are common across all industries under 4 pillars. And they've mobilized the support. I think a great thing is they've mobilized support at the corporate community at the CEO level, as opposed to the sustainability or CSR group, which has always been, in my view, second-class citizens. And this will be input to the work that the Sustainability Standards Board does. It is not intended to be sort of an alternative and competing set of standards. As I said in my opening remarks, these acronyms of, the 21 metrics, IBCWF, SASB, IRC, TCFD, those acronyms, in my view, all kind of go away. And it's assumed in the Sustainability Standards Board. In terms of the EU, that's an interesting, complicated question. Who am I to talk about the EU sitting here in the United States, Lexington, Massachusetts, land of the free, home of the brave? The EU taxonomy has got different elements, including, as Judith said, the non-financial reporting directive. I think there's a couple ways to look at this. One is that the NFRD is going to be a competing set of standards to the Sustainability Standards Board. I don't happen to see it that way. My view, as I said, is I think that the Sustainability Standards Board is like the baseline. It's the floor. There's additional work that can be done, reporting that can be required. I think that's where the EU taxonomy comes in. That's where I think there's opportunity for EU leadership. It's going to be up to the foundation and the EU, kind of how they sort us out, just like they got us sorted out with China and the United States. The SFDR thing, I mean, this is an odd thing to me. I got to be honest. It seems to me like they're like a little bit a step ahead of everything else, because there's this chicken and egg thing that they're going to have these products, Article 8 and Article 9. I don't know as much about this as I do the taxonomy, but I've been reading about it. Ultimately, classifying these products from an investor point of view is going to depend upon information you're getting from companies. So they've come out with kind of a taxonomy for what these products are going to be in the SFDR, while they're still working on the non-financial reporting directive, which is going to be the information that comes from companies so that asset managers can describe their products as meeting whatever these criteria happen to be. And right now, these are largely in the environmental dimension around green. Let me just take this opportunity to address one other really good question that came up a couple of times, which is like, what does all this standard stuff that I'm talking about have to do with purpose? Let me be honest. I mean, it's like not a silver bullet at all. And in some ways you could say not much. Loic was absolutely right in making the distinction between output and outcomes. Purpose is about, outcomes and impact. I think the work of the Sustainability Standards Board is it gives us a floor. It's about activities and operations in companies. It's not about impact. You can build on that to get impact measures. That's where the Value Balancing Alliance comes from monetization point of view. Judith mentioned the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative. So, it's a foundation that you need. It's not the solution. The solution is getting to, as Loic was talking about, impact metrics. And what's important about impact metrics is that what makes them so challenging is that you need data from outside the company. Financial stuff, sustainability stuff, you can gather that data in the company. If you take the example of pets and you say, better quality of life, did they live longer? Well, the company's not going to have those data unless they're collecting it from the veterinarians and the people they deal with. Are their quality of lives better? Did they visit the vet less often? You need to get data from outside of the company's walls. And so, one of the criticisms that people make about the SSB is that it doesn't get the impact. Like, fair enough, but horses for courses, and let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, because what the IFRS Foundation knows how to do is mediate, as I said, the information between companies and investors. Last thing, and maybe Canin wants to weigh in on this, is even if we have impact metrics, which we don't yet, I don't know what the company should use to report on their purpose, because purpose is unique. The company needs to decide what its purpose is. Then the company needs to say, and we are going to measure the accomplishment of our purpose in this way. And for a while, it may be very bespoke. It may be unique. Maybe we'll get to some standards that companies can choose from. Maybe ultimately that purpose measure a couple of key metrics. Maybe that will be something that's always going to be bespoke for companies. And I think a lot of what the work is we're talking about today is to sort of rationalize this whole landscape. But again, let's not assume that it's a silver bullet in terms of, the ultimate answer for how you kind of communicate on the accomplishment of your purpose. Because then in the end, the reporting, if it's not kind of used by engagement, if investors don't make decisions, if stakeholders don't make decisions, then it's not really going to matter. Colin, maybe would you like to weigh in on this kind of specific question of measuring and reporting on purpose?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Bob, that it should be specific to a company. What is being looked for from standardization are factors that are generically regarded as being important to the investor community, both in terms of thinking about returns and also in terms of and value creation and in terms of risk. From the point of view of a purpose, the issue is to what extent can one find evidence of the degree to which a company is fulfilling its purpose? And I think Loic set that out extremely well in terms of thinking about the outcomes that are necessary from the pet care business in terms of delivering that objective of creating a better world for pets. And the key is that in terms of trying to develop a purpose, the company has to demonstrate both internally and externally the extent to which it is fulfilling that purpose. And what we try to set out in the Measuring Purpose paper is, how do you go from that notion of a purpose to defining the metrics, not just in terms of traditional ESG metrics, but in terms of exactly the outcomes and the impacts that Loic was talking about. And from those, you can then move to some way of trying to attach monetary values to them, either in terms of a cost sense or in terms of a valuation sense. And that is something that inevitably is going to be driven by the specific purpose of a company.
Thank you very much, both Colin and Bob. I would like to move to one more question that I think, Loic, your answer would be very valuable too. And there's a few questions that came around this. Essentially, it is around the question of, if you implement purpose and try to measure it, and how far is it about the business model and value creation versus the notion of value preservation? So really the notion of do no harm. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, and I think it depends on the dimension you look at. So in some cases, it might be value preservation. For example, I think in the case of natural capital, this is very much, when you consume raw materials and you consume natural capitals, how do you make sure you do that smartly and replenish it so that you can continue to have a business going forward, and that's, in that case, it is preservation. In other cases, when you really set yourself out to solve a problem that people have, that today they have no solution for, you are actually expanding the value you're creating. And I think from that point of view, it's two different mindsets. And in a business, you're constantly looking. If I look at my business on an output measure, we are certainly dependent on veterinarians recommending our product as part of the path to care and their solution. And if we find that, we are abusing that recommendation, so, they put their name behind our brands because we help their practice. But if they find that somehow this is not serving them, we will be, in the end, tapping into their social capital, their reputation, potentially damaging that. And then in return, our business over the long term, they will stop seeing us part of the equation of their own practice. And in this case, our business will not thrive. So, to some extent, this is value preservation. Now, on the other hand, if we help them be better at managing their practice so that they are more satisfied, they spend less time on the administration side, on the people management aspect, on how do they position their offer, how do they specialize themselves, and so on. So, I'll give you an example. We noticed that, for example, cat owners are not regularly going to vets. Basically, cats are very hard to transport, and going to a veterinarian is a painful experience, because when you bring your cat in a practice, there are dogs there, and so cats don't like it. And so we really looked at how can we change that, because this is a problem for the health of the cat, in generally speaking, and the owner are stressed by it, and the clinics are stressed by it. And so, remember, we only do keyballs in a bag, but what we set out to do is to understand this problem and solve it. And so in this case, we interviewed many veterinarians, vet technicians, and pet owner, cat owners, to understand what are the barriers. And then we developed a set of activities to help veterinarians, to the point that the ultimate of that is to become a cat-friendly clinic with a label. So we partnered with an association that basically certify a clinic to be cat-friendly clinic. And we don't do that on a compete basis. It's a non-compete agnostic basis, where we give them the recipe book to become like that, which basically talk about having a separate reception area for cat owners, having separate consultation room, high-rise furniture so that your cat can be on a high and not worry about the dog down, on the floor, things like this. And so when you do that, what happens? You make it easier for the cat owner to bring their cat to the vet, so they come more frequently. You improve the health of that animal, the care for it. You improve the financial performance of the veterinary clinic, because they basically have more patients. So in that case, you're expanding and you're creating more value all along the chain. The cat are healthier. We know that if a cat owner goes quickly, early in the phase of adoption, he will have a better reflex on when to go, and he will be less afraid of going, and therefore the cat will be better cared for. If it's better cared for, it will live longer. And the veterinarians basically feel better because they can treat the issues. There is nothing worse for a vet than when the owner comes too late and there is nothing else to do. So really, by doing this activity, and we rolled it out, it's called Take Your Cat to the Vet. We are now implementing in 65 countries with industry association, not just by ourselves. We are expanding the overall category, but by really being totally on purpose. And so in this case, it's value creation, not value preservation. I think every time it's on both, and depending on the risk level for the company, or the kind of opportunity it creates for your purpose, this is where you put your resources. And obviously, a company always have to make trade-off. There is too many things to do, so you have to make choices. But having this kind of mindset of when is it that you're preserving your business, actually, it mightn't be an important investment today, but if you don't do it today, you really put the business at risk tomorrow. Or is it an investment you make because you are actually expanding the health of the ecosystem? And by doing that, you're creating more value for everybody in the chain. So both are true, and both requires action and investment. And of course, there is a trade-off mechanic in the business every time.
Thank you very much, Loic. And we're almost at the end of this exciting webinar. We've heard a lot to digest, and there are so many questions that we unfortunately couldn't get into, but thank you so much for your participation. Before we end, as promised on the hour, I want to invite Colin Mayer, who's the co-editor of this book, to please reflect on what was said in a few final words.
Okay, Judith, thank you very much indeed. I just really would like to reflect on a few questions that came in that we didn't have a chance to address, which were really around the idea of, have we established a method of measuring purpose? Have we actually demonstrated what is required to do that? And I think that what this panel has done has been to illustrate precisely how that can happen. From the material that Loic was talking about in terms of thinking about a business with a particular purpose, and how that then translates into the outcomes that need to be evaluated in terms of the delivery of that purpose, to thinking about the impact it has on the well-being of the relevant parties, in this case, the cats and dogs. And that element has to be thought of also in the context of the external influences. So we were saying that the purpose that drives it within the business has to reflect it in terms of the outcomes that are relevant within the business, and then the impact that it's having using outside information as well. And a key element of that outside impact is not just on the pet owners, but also on the investors in the business. And then thinking about that in the context of the various attempts to provide standardization of metrics that are relevant across companies is a key factor, so that a company cannot just think about it internally within the notion of the purpose it's striving to create. It also has to think about how this is being evaluated externally, perhaps from external stakeholders, and certainly from their investor community, because if they don't bring their investor community along with them, then, as we've seen in the case of Danone, however purposeful a company is, if it isn't perceived to be delivering value to its investors, then however committed the CEO or the board is to the delivery of the purpose, it's very difficult to sustain that. So we've seen those two influences very much coming together in this presentation, and the relevant measures that are needed to be able to undertake both elements of the specific purpose within a company and the external factors that are reflected in the standardization that's going on. So I'd just like to thank all of our speakers, Bob, Loic, Judith, and Bruno, for this really tremendous discussion, and very much look forward then to welcoming you all back. As was said at the beginning, we're not going to be having a session next week, but we will be in 2 weeks' time, and hope you'll be able to join us then. So thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.